When you're first getting started with sourdough baking, it can be kind of confusing trying to navigate how to feed and maintain your sourdough starter. When should you feed it? What ratios should you feed it? When is it ready to be baked with? I've got those answers and more in this complete guide to keeping your starter happy. I'm going to go over the different phases of a sourdough starter, and then I'll share a couple of methods of maintaining it and answer some common questions. Let's dive in. First, I'd like to point out that there are 3 main phases that your starter will go through. Phase 1 is when you're first getting your starter going from scratch. Make sure to check out my How to Make a Starter from Scratch tutorial if you don't have one yet. You'll need to be more careful about how you feed your starter in this phase because your starter is more delicate. Phase 2 is once your starter is established, but it's still fragile. This is usually about 2 to 4 weeks after you first get your starter going. During this phase, you'll be able to bake with your starter, but it's still too fragile for you to miss very many feedings or to store it in the refrigerator. Once your starter is 2 to 4 weeks old, it'll probably enter phase 3. This is when your starter is strong and it can handle some variations in temperature and feeding. If you neglect your starter for too long, it may return to phase 2 for a while, but it should bounce back with regular feedings. Now let's discuss hydration levels and types of flour. I keep my starter at 100% hydration, which means I feed it equal weights, not volumes, of flour and water. So for example, I wouldn't feed it half a cup of flour and half a cup of water. I would feed it something like 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. Also, I feed it organic all-purpose flour. If you keep your starter at a different hydration percentage, or you feed it a different type of flour than I do, then it will react differently than my starter. Another thing I would like to note is that every starter is an individual, so you're going to have to kind of learn your starter, and this is why often the times that sourdough bakers give to you are estimations, so like 4 to 12 hours. It's because your starter and your home is an individual. It all depends on what flour you're feeding it, how warm your kitchen is, how active your starter is. All of these variables can change how your starter reacts to things. So yes, sourdough baking is a science, but it's also kind of an art. A mistake that I sometimes see beginner sourdough bakers make is you follow the time laid out by the recipe exactly instead of going by visual cues. And this could lead to some results that you weren't really looking for. This video is brought to you by my cookbook, Favorite Sourdough Recipes. It's available in ebook format, and it features 20 of my favorite sourdough recipes that I've developed over the past 5 years, including sourdough sandwich bread, English muffins, brioche, donuts, dinner rolls, pizza crust, tortillas, and more. Besides the recipes, this handy ebook includes a recipe for making a sourdough starter from scratch, as well as sourdough troubleshooting tips. Once you purchase the cookbook, you'll immediately receive a PDF file that you can download and view on your device and get to sourdough baking. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of how to feed your sourdough starter. Feeding your starter is so very easy. Simply add equal weights of organic all-purpose flour and filtered water to your sourdough starter and give it a really good stir. You want to make sure that everything is really well combined because you don't want any dry patches of flour, and you want to kind of incorporate all of that starter throughout the mixture. You don't want the starter to just be sitting at the bottom. Now put the lid on your jar. You can add a rubber band to mark the height of your starter, and then place your starter in a warm spot in your kitchen and allow it to at least double in volume before using. It can take anywhere from 2 to 12 hours for your starter to reach its peak fermentation. This depends on how active your starter is, what feeding ratio you used, what flour you used, and how warm your kitchen is. Now you might be wondering, what is peak fermentation? This is when your starter reaches its peak height and activity after feeding it. It will likely have a little dome on top depending on what type of flour you fed it. Some types of flour, such as einkorn, may not have that little dome on top when it reaches peak fermentation. Now, peak might not be doubled in volume. Your starter could rise even higher than that before it reaches peak. To know for sure if your starter has reached peak, you can wait until it just starts to fall and lose a little bit of its air bubbles before using it. But for optimal results, you want to catch it right around peak. You can use your starter a little before or a little after peak, but if you go much outside of that window, it will affect your final results. If you leave your starter for too long after it's reached peak, it will eventually sink back down to its original height when you first fed it. If this happens, simply feed your starter again and wait for it to reach peak before you use it. So now you might be wondering, how much should you feed your starter? Well, of course, it all depends on how much starter you need for your recipe, but you'll want to feed it a bit more than what you'll need for your final recipe. So if your recipe calls for 220 grams of starter, Feed your base starter so that you end up with 250 grams of starter total in your jar. That way you'll have a bit left over in your jar to feed after you pour off what you need in your recipe. Okay, now let's go over feeding ratios. As a general guideline, you'll want to feed your starter at a 1:1:1 ratio of starter, flour, and water, or greater. It's okay to feed at a higher ratio, such as 1:5:5, 1:10:10, or even 1:20:20, but you want to make sure that you're feeding your starter the same weight or greater than the base starter. For example, if you have 50 grams of starter in your jar, you want to feed it at least 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. A 1:5:5 ratio would be 50 grams of starter, 250 grams of flour, and 250 grams of water. If you feed your starter at a ratio of greater than 1:1:1, this is known as overfeeding your starter. Keep in mind that if you overfeed your starter, it will most likely take longer for it to double in volume or reach peak. And this might actually be desirable, which I'll discuss later. Now, you might be wondering, how often do you need to feed your starter? And the short answer is whenever it's hungry. You can tell that your starter is hungry if it has doubled in volume, fallen again, and begins to smell sour. Again, this usually takes anywhere from 4 to 12 hours. If your starter is really strong and your house isn't very warm, you might be able to get away with feeding it once a day. But if your starter is really active and doubling a few hours after feeding it, it's best to feed it at least twice a day. If you store your starter in the refrigerator, you'll only need to feed it once a week. I'll discuss that method more in a bit. Now, a question that I get fairly often is, do I need to discard my sourdough starter every time I feed it? When you're in the beginning stages of phase 1, you'll want to throw out some of your starter every time you feed it. There can be some funky smells and flavors at the beginning before the good bacteria has had a chance to get established. After that, you'll want to discard it every time you feed it until it's ready to be baked with. But at this phase, you don't have to throw out the starter. You can save it in a jar in the refrigerator and use it to make pancakes when you have enough. Once your starter is in phase 2 or 3, you'll still want to pour off some starter every time you feed it, but in this stage, what you pour off can be what you use in your recipe. Then you can feed whatever's left in the jar so it's ready for your next bake or feeding. If you don't pour off or use some of your starter before feeding it, you'll probably start to drown in sourdough starter. Alright, now let's go over a couple of sample feeding schedules. The first one will be if you intend to bake every day. If you want to use your starter every day, you'll want to keep it at room temperature and feed it daily. A great way to do this is to feed your starter in the morning when you get up, and again just before you go to bed. Some recipes do better with a midday feeding, so you might have to switch up the feeding schedule now and then. But you'll want to aim for 2 feedings a day. It's okay to miss a feeding here and there, but if you're finding that your starter is getting sluggish, you'll want to be more consistent with those feedings. Now, if you don't want to use your starter every day, this next feeding schedule is for you. You simply store your starter in the refrigerator until you're ready to bake with it. Now, this feeding schedule will only work if your starter is in phase 3, or basically it's showing signs of strength and resilience. So the method is basically, after you use your starter for baking, feed it and then either put it directly into the refrigerator or let it sit out at room temperature for an hour or 2 and then pop it into the fridge. You could go up to a week between feedings with this method. Then when you want to bake something, you can either use your starter directly from the fridge or go through 1 or 2 feeding cycles at room temperature before baking with it. Some recipes will do well with a starter directly from the fridge, but more delicate recipes may require feeding it a time or 2 to wake it up again. Okay, now I'd like to go over a no-waste sourdough method. If you're careful about how much you feed your starter, you can escape having to pour cupfuls of it out. So whenever you feed your starter, carefully calculate how much you'll need in the recipe. Then feed your starter so that you'll use up all but about 30 grams of starter in your recipe. For example, if your starter calls for 240 grams of sourdough starter, feed what you have in the jar so that you end up with 270 grams total starter in the jar. So if you start with 90 grams of starter in the jar, feed it 90 grams each of flour and water to end up with 270 grams. So after you use the 240 grams of starter in your recipe, you'll be left with 30 grams in the jar, which you can feed 30 grams each of flour and water. Then you'll have 90 grams of starter in the jar, ready to be fed for the next time you want to bake. Of course, if you want to bake with it again right away, you can simply feed it the amount that you'll need in your recipe. And if you ever miscalculate and have a bit of extra starter on your hands, you can always just pour that into a separate jar and store it in the refrigerator for discard recipes. Now, another method of feeding that is similar is the Scrapings Method. I'm so grateful that my sister taught me this method right from the start when I was first getting started with sourdough. It's so freeing to realize that you can use up almost every bit of starter in your jar, and it's no big deal. Like I said, this is similar to the no waste method, but you only feed your starter a tiny bit more than what you'll need in your recipe. Then after you pour off what you need in your recipe, you'll literally be left with just the scrapings in the jar. Then you would feed this at a really high ratio to get it ready for your next recipe. You might be shocked at how just those scrapings in the jar will blossom to life again. Now let's clear up a few more common questions. So you might be wondering if you should leave your sourdough starter out after after feeding it. If you're feeding your starter to get it ready to be baked with, you'll want to leave it out at room temperature in a warm spot so it has a chance to get all bubbly and reach peak fermentation. But if you're feeding your starter just before storing it in the fridge for the week, you don't have to leave it out before popping it into the fridge. Another question is, can you feed your starter at night and then use it in the morning? Yes, this is something that I do quite often, and this is a great time to use a higher feeding ratio. You can experiment to see what ratio of feeding works well so that when you wake up, your starter is at peak. You might want to do a 1-10-10, 1-20-20. Just experiment and see what works for your kitchen. But if your kitchen is really warm and you're feeding it at a lower ratio, your starter might double and reach peak overnight and then fall, and then it's not at an ideal time to use it. You could probably still get away with it, but it's best to use it in that peak window. Now, if you ever run into trouble with your sourdough starter, you find that it's getting some funky smells, or heaven forbid it grows mold, make sure to check out my sourdough starter troubleshooting guide, and I'll have that article linked in the description. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment below and I'll do my best to answer it. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and make sure to check out this video next that YouTube thinks you'll enjoy. Make sure to check out my how to make, my sister taught me this riff. I'm so, let's clear up a couple more. Now, all right, if you found this,